Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. So tonight I want to touch on something that I touch on quite a bit on this cast, but I think I want to take it a little deeper, and that is cultural Catholicism and the importance of faith within culture and how culture reinforces faith. You know, it's interesting because I'm a child of two worlds. It's like I said before, born and raised in America, but my parents were old school Sicilian. No, let me correct that. Old world Sicilian. um, when I was a young boy, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. My family immigrated here in the 1960s, and we gravitated toward the Port of Los Angeles area. And my grandfather was in the fishing industry, had an uncle in the fishing industry. My grandmother's, my grandfather's side of the family, or my mother's side of the family, excuse me, was all in the fishing industry. My father's side of the families were all bricklayers, construction. My father actually helped rebuild Europe after World War II, both in Italy and in Germany. And I'm going to get to that here in a few minutes. And, you know, I got to experience something different, something unique growing up, again, as a son of an immigrant. Man, I don't know how I don't think it's very, how should I say this, unique. There's a lot of us that experience this, but I'm one that likes to talk about it because I think we've lost the essence of culture, and not just within the realm of Sicilians or Italians or Irish or Germans, but even Americans. Americans have lost their culture in many ways. Now, some ways I've argued that American culture was always kind of malformed from the very beginning. I believe that goes back to its Protestant origins, but that's for another time. And growing up, I saw two different worlds. There was something different going on in my home than the world in the outside, where I was dealing with, you know, people from American culture and Protestants and Jews and you know, different races. When I'm going to grammar school and grade school and high school and things like that, when I went home, it was more deeply traditional Catholic, more deeply traditional Italian, and it was a strange kind of dichotomy of sorts, right? And in time, I had to work that out in my mind. I had to work out sort of the greater macro public life I lived, but my micro life within the home was different. It was a very interesting upbringing, let's put it that way. And the root of this, of course, is very deeply Italian and really Sicilian for me. And for those of you who know, I studied history in college. I still consider myself a historian. It's not an official title. It's an unofficial title I've given myself, but my love of history began when I was very young, probably 10, 11, 12 years old, because I remember the stories my father used to tell me about the war. My father was born in 1935 in Marsala, Sicily. For those of you who don't know, Marsala, Sicily is very famous for the salt fields. It's very famous for oils and wines and things like that. And it's also the port of entry for Garibaldi when he landed on Sicilian island, and how he and his 1,000 red shirts would unify Italy, right? Whatever we may think of that, right? And I have my opinions on that, but that's for another time. But that's where Garibaldi landed. I went there back in 1986 when I was a kid and had a lot of vivid memories, and it was a nice little town. It had lots of Arab ascents, right? Because again, the Sicilian island, it's like I've said so many times, we Sicilians, we did pluralism right? Because that island was conquered by so many empires throughout its history that it really has a mixed bag of pluralism, right? From the Greeks to the Romans to the Arabs to the Normans. I mean, you name it. It's just everything is kind of accumulated there. And the part where my father came from, and my mother as well too, there was a big Arab influence there. Right? Lots of the foods, the spices, and the sugars, and that's why the food is so delicious in that part of the world. But my father grew up at a time of utter devastation, war, poverty. When the Allied invasion of Sicily started in 1943, it was devastating at the time to Italians and Sicilians especially. My father told me stories of the bombing runs and how they had to flee the city and head to the countryside to, get away from a lot of the main targets the best they could. Told me about the devastation of the buildings being blown up, the dead bodies all over the place, and the sheer hunger that existed. They didn't know where their next meal was coming from. In fact, stories of my uncles would gather up the potato peels of the German soldiers after they had discarded them, right? And that's what they would eat. You found food wherever you could. It was starvation, right? And by that time, Italy had really fallen out of the war, and Hitler had sent down his troops all the way down to the Sicilian island to defend it. This was probably right around the time, well, right after the time Mussolini was deposed by the king of the House of Savoy. And eventually he will, of course, become the leader of the Republic of Salo, right, for a short time. But at that time, it was devastating, man. I mean, you got to remember, there's no resources there. There's no social services, right? You don't know where your next meal is coming from. There's no medicines. You're concocting home remedies to deal with your ailments and your sicknesses and your diseases. There's no educational system in place. It's all gone. The island was being bombed into rubbles in many ways, and it was true despair all over the place. And that's when I fell in love with history, because I realized that my father went through something that was very difficult. Now, he was very young, 7, 8 years old when the war, when that invasion started in 1943. War ends at 45. He's about 9, 10 years old. He's very young, but he remembered it very vividly, and something that most people would remember very vividly. But it's interesting because, I talk about the importance of culture, especially Catholic culture, because oftentimes I think as American Catholics, we play this game, this Protestantized game in America, Catholics do, right? Where it all becomes an intellectual assent. And I've talked about it before, right? Being Sicilian, our Catholic faith over there was very folklore, right? Because it wasn't a part of the world where education was highly valued, especially during that time when my father was being raised. My father didn't even go to school. I think he taught himself how to do basic math so he could become a businessman later on. And I think he has something like equivalent of a second grade education. That's it. And came to America eventually and became a very successful businessman, right? It's one of those stories. And you just didn't have the infrastructure in place. And so you got a situation where you're learning how to fend for yourself in a way that's tragic, obviously, and hard, but even more so, my grandparents, my father's mother and my father's father passed away at a very young age. My father was only 1 year old when he lost both of his parents, which left 7 siblings all by themselves to take care of themselves. My father was the youngest of 7 brothers and sisters. And not only were they in the midst of a war, trying to figure out how they're going to survive, but both the mother and the father, the patriarchs of the family, passed away because of various illnesses. I mean, this is the kind of tragedy my father was raised in. It's why I've told you, when I look at the world around me, people say, who are your role models? Who are your heroes? First that comes to my list is my father. And eventually he would do something so brave that I probably would be too scared to do. He leaves Italy to come to America to find a new life. Not even, it's one of those stories where he even speak the language, and he had $20 in his pocket. That's all he had, in a dream kind of a thing, right? He had a little help. My mom's side of the family had come here a few years earlier, obviously, and and you gravitate toward other Italian communities in America, but still, it took a lot of courage to do that kind of stuff. And in many ways, it's something I've always admired. And my father passed away in '97, and I miss him dearly. But he's in my mind, he's remained a hero to me, right? Because of the challenges he faced, and I couldn't even imagine. Because I had the pleasure of growing up in a well-adjusted Catholic home. I don't, I don't know what the concept of the broken family is, right? I hear it all around me. I hear this family got divorced and these children are born out of wedlock and she had an abortion and they're living out of wedlock. I had no idea about this lifestyle, right? This was really an American phenomenon in many ways. And that's why when I started going to grammar school and then eventually junior high school is what we used to call it, and eventually high school, what was so strange, these two worlds that in many ways conflicted and contradicted each other, right? Deeply Catholic and Sicilian and traditional in the home, and the outside of the world, a very liberal America where everybody rebels against everything, right? The spirit of rebellion in America. And of course, I never had that spirit of rebellion. I always honored and respected the traditions that were handed down to my family. I had a little bit of wild spirit, but nothing seriously rebellious when I was young. And so when I started going to grammar school, I noticed immediately, I was a dumb kid, I'll be honest with you, but there's certain things I picked up on, right? And that is in a culture where it was predominantly, well, it was divided into two main groups, right? Catholics and Protestants. The Catholic groups were the Italians, the Croatians, and the Hispanics, and then you had your white Protestants and your black Protestants. And when I went to school, it was an interesting dichotomy. The white Protestants, black Protestants all came from broken families. Divorces were rampant all over the place. Those that were in the Catholic camp, Croatians, Italians, and Hispanics, their families stayed intact at that time. And this was something that hit me very hard because I didn't understand it. Because marriage is a sacrament in Catholicism, right? It's prized, it's for life, it's cherished, you live it with great honor and great pride. This is your family. And so when I went to school and started intermingling with a bunch of Protestant kids, it's just like, huh, so that's how you guys do it, right? I didn't understand it. It was strange. It was odd, you know? And these are the issues that I kind of dealt with. And to make a long story short, I found a new series on Netflix. Just came out a couple of days ago, I think, called From Scratch. And it's a story about an American girl, a black girl, pretty black girl, that young lady from who played Uhura in the new Star Trek movies, right? She's in this movie. It's kind of a love romance kind of a thing. She's an artist. She goes to Florence, Italy. She meets an Italian, actually a Sicilian guy, and they fall in love, right? I'm only 3 episodes into this thing, but I've been drawn into this because it really highlights the cross-cultural experiences between a Sicilian and American culture. And the movie really highlights a lot of things that I saw growing up as a Sicilian in America. And the interesting thing about it all is the young lady in this, right? The young black girl, American girl, she lives in LA, and I was born and raised in LA. So it's perfectly me, right? Sicilian descent. She meets and marries a Sicilian kid or Sicilian boy, and she lives in LA, and they're kind of going back and forth between Sicily and LA, which was my world growing up, right? But in the midst of this, the challenges of the cross cultures between a more traditional Catholic Italian culture versus a more liberal, pluralistic American culture and how these two individuals are going to try and make this relationship and ultimately this marriage work. Of course, the family of the American girl is like, okay, hey, they're in love. It's love, baby. Who can say no to love, 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 right? Because we love to throw that word around in America, right? Everything is love and everything's justified in the name of love. And you can never say no in the name of love. But in Sicilian culture, things are a little bit more serious, right? Love is an important factor. Nobody can show love more than the Sicilians can. Trust me on that, right? But the family had challenges for their son that was marrying the American girl. The first of which is, well, she's not Catholic. Second of which, she's an American. And guess what? Americans get divorced. See, marriage in Italian cultures, it's a sacred act. And there's one moment in the movie where, because the family has completely rejected the boy, they're not even showing up to the wedding because it's not even a church wedding in Florence, in Italy. That's the irony of it all, right? Only the bride's family shows up in the movie or in this series on Netflix, right? The father of the Sicilian boy is upset and angry because the son has rebelled against everything that's traditional. And in some ways, they make a caricature of the father, but there's some reasonable objections from my perspective as somebody who's more traditionally minded and Catholic. They don't show up to the wedding up in Florence, and they don't get married in church, like I said, and they kind of have this pastor show up, kind of what you would see in America, actually, right? Something outdoors, no sacred consecrated hands, telling each other vows, making up as they go along, whatever that means, right? Whatever that means. I don't know. I'm more traditional. I wanted the sacred hands of the priesthood, of holy orders, blessing my marriage under the altar of God, right? My wife laid down roses, flowers at the feet of Our Lady, right? In the sacrament of marriage, where we received Holy Communion. But that's how we do it in Italy. That's how we do it as Sicilians, right? It matters to us because our faith is everything to us. Well, it was. There's been problems over there since the end of World War II, but that's a byproduct of Americanism and democracy that was kind of infused in Italy after World War II, and that's for another time. But at one point, the family of the Sicilian kid is wondering, wait a minute, what's going on here? The Sicilian kid's family is not here. And the father or the father-in-law to be was like, wait a minute, man. Come on, son. Tell me what's going on here. Where's your family? Why aren't they here? I mean, they're 45 minutes away. We flew all the way out from America, 13 hours, we're crying out loud. And your family's 45 minutes away and they're not here? What's going on? And the Sicilian kid says, well, they don't approve. Yeah, I'm marrying an American. Americans get divorced. That's what Americans do. Italians don't get divorced. And if you do get divorced, by the way, it's a long process and it takes years from my understanding, right? And he elaborated a little bit more, so something very interesting. And that is, if my father were to come here and bless this marriage, and then eventually I were to get divorced, or we were to get divorced, I was from your daughter, that would come off as a great act of shame and disgrace upon the family. And quite frankly, it hit me because there's a lot of truth to that, because it's how we hold marriage sacred, right? It's why you do get married under the altar of God. It's why it's a sacrament in the Catholic Church. And it's why Italians, like a lot of other Catholic communities throughout the world, whether it's Hispanics, whether it's Filipinos, right? It's why Catholics build strong familial bonds, and why Protestant nations, they destroy families. They don't keep families together. That's a general tendency, right? Because of sacramental nature and a devotion to true faith and true religion and a true covenant, right? And a covenant, when I say a covenant, I'm talking about the original covenant set up by Jesus Christ, not the covenants that we proclaim as Americans that we somehow continue to renegotiate constantly in America, which is really not a covenant, but it's us dictating our own terms to God. These traditions have been laid out by our ancestors for thousands of years, and they've worked. Now, we may reject those traditions because we don't like them. They may be too restrictive, right? And in a Protestant culture like America, right, freedom and liberty trump everything, including God, right? This is why you hear certain talk show hosts in America say how our freedoms are they're all God ordained, right? They're all God ordained. So pornography in America, you can't ban pornography, even though it's terrible, even though it destroys culture, it destroys family, it destroys the minds of our young men and young ladies, right? We can't, because God prizes our freedoms more than the sin that he condemns. To outlaw the freedom that God gave us is a greater violation than actually the poison of pornography and banning that, right? And that's because Americans have never been able to figure out this whole thing, how to deal with sin and how we conflate liberty and freedom with sin, and ultimately find a way to justify our sins through the concept of freedom and liberty. And that's what always haunts Americans. And it's why the culture is falling apart. And it's why the marriage has been devastated, right? What are the principles Americans live by when it comes to marriage? Freedom, liberty. You can get divorced anytime you want. It goes back to that whole covenant thing, because marriage is a covenant and it's a permanent covenant. But in America, you get to recreate your own covenants anytime you want, just like a lot of right-wing talk show hosts talk about. So if you're not happy in your marriage, you have a right to rebel, break the covenant, and then go create a new covenant. It's endless covenants in America. But in Sicily, in Italian cultures, it's one covenant. And God gave us that 2,000 years ago that he built on Peter the Rock. And that's understood. And it's why Italians, Hispanics, Filipinos, African Catholics, it's wherever you go, Spanish, it's why we've built such strong familial bonds. Because that covenant is always honored. It's not something you tinker with. It's not an imaginary friend, right? You got the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. No. It's permanent, that covenant. And these cultural differences, they matter. And the cultural reinforcements that reverberate through culture matter. I'll go back to the story of my father now. And this is what I mean. And why culture is so important in our Catholic faith. Again, my father was the youngest of 7 siblings. The patriarchs of the family. My grandmother, my grandfather passed away. You have 7 siblings left all by themselves in the midst of poverty, war, devastation, a world that's gone absolutely mad. These 7 siblings had to take care of themselves. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that same scenario in America, what that would mean? Conservatives like to talk a lot about the importance of a mother or father in a home, because when there's not, for example, when there's not a father in a home, all these statistics show how the kids go wayward, right? They get in crime, they do drugs, they rebel, teenage pregnancy, right? The father, we got to keep the father in the home, and you got to keep the parents together, family values, conservatism, right? And there's a lot of truth to that in America. But see, in a Catholic society, when there's no parents around, or when one parent dies, or whatever it may be, in a Catholic society, people don't necessarily get lost when tragedy hits them, because there's cultural reinforcements of the faith, of a Catholic community. In America, we don't have that. We're a secular culture. And the reason why when daddy walks out on the family or both parents die and there's a tragedy like that, why the kids get consumed up in so much adverse behavior is because now the cultural reinforcement is secular. It's the porn industry. It's rock music. It's Hollywood. It's all the secular values that actually oftentimes contradict true faith and true religion. And that's who raises kids. Because in America, only parents can be that buffer to protect them. But in my father's case, and all my aunts and uncles on that side of the family lost their mother and father, they never lost their sense of morality. They never lost their sense of stability. They all got married. They all raised beautiful families. They were all well adjusted. I got a beautiful family out in Boston that I visited back in October. We talked about some of these stories and the miracle that my father's side of the family has been. And you say to yourself, well, why? Well, how did that happen? Because you put the same scenario in America where you got 7 siblings, both parents are gone. That's going to lead to a whole host of issues, right? It's going to lead to the drugs. It's going to lead to the sex. It's going to lead to abortion. It's going to lead to contraception, right? It's going to lead to a whole host of human brokenness. But in Sicily in 1930s, it didn't. You know why? Because the culture was Catholic. And the church had a symbiotic relationship with the culture and even the government in many respects. Culture matters, ladies and gentlemen. It does. Because even when you lose both parents in this life, as tragic as that is, if your culture reinforces the same values your parents would have taught you, there's a chance you could survive such a tragedy. In my father's case, and my aunts and uncles outside of the family, they all survived. They're all well adjusted. They didn't go down the path of the human brokenness we see in secular and Protestant cultures throughout the West now. Because the culture was Catholic. Your neighbors are Catholic. Your policemen are Catholic. Your politicians are Catholic. Your mayor is Catholic. The grocery store worker is Catholic, right? The church plays a prominent role in the center of the piazza as the backdrop of the faith. So when you gather in the center of town to meet for critical issues, or you gather there to celebrate, the church is always there. It becomes subconscious in your mind. It becomes part of who you are. The greatest values we have are not freedom and liberty. Freedom and liberty are a state of being. Freedom and liberty can be good. We all have an intrinsic right to freedom to a certain respect, but not when they see the laws of God. That is the great mistakes of American conservatism today. They've never figured that out. But that's because American conservatives have never known true faith and true religion. They've accepted this pluralistic, indifferent approach because we're a Protestant Masonic nation in America. So there's a lack of that cohesion and truth in the midst of the culture. And in those cultures, families survived. And also, too, it's just revolution, the concept of revolution, it doesn't exist in those cultures. Well, let me take that back. Not to the level that we see here in America, right? Or in Western liberal republics, where everything's like freedom, liberty, freedom, liberty. I get to rebel, kiss my ass. I can do whatever I want to do. No, there's order first. There's respect first. And there's God first. And within that realm, you have the freedom to do what is right. You have the freedom to establish some well-ordered principles to be who you want to be. but understanding there's greater things in ourselves as individuals to serve God, serve culture, serve community, to serve your family. That's what we've lost in America that we don't understand. And there's no getting that back unless we fix a bunch of things, starting with culture. And you don't have real culture, to be honest with you, without true faith. Now, that doesn't say there hasn't been some communities throughout world history that haven't gotten it right, even though they're not Catholic. Listen, I think Asian culture is beautiful. I know they're pagans over there, but they get a few things right. But the pagans in those communities don't preach freedom and liberty first. They don't preach these liberal principles that come back to destroy the individual, society, and culture. There's a greater metaphysical belief out there. It's why I've always said, like, for example, in America, one generation constantly rebels against the previous generation. Children are always rebelling against their parents in America. And it's always been that way. Why? Why? I don't understand that. As an Italian, as a Sicilian, I never felt the need to rebel against my parents. In fact, Catholic cultures, like other cultures, like Asian cultures, Hispanic cultures, they always found a reason to honor our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. Even the Native Americans in America honored their ancestral roots. But why is it in America we don't honor that? Because like I've said before to you, it's the concepts, the idea of revolution. It's disordered. It's disordered. Because once you go down the path of revolution, especially a revolution that rebels against true faith and true religion, at what point, whoever declares the revolution over, when? Once you rebelled against the God-given authority that God gave us, which was the church, and the Protestants started this rebellion. When does the revolution end? In America, it never ends. And the revolutions in America get more extreme with every generation. I ain't got to even mention the craziness we're getting in this millennial and generation X, Y, Z, P, Q, LG, whatever it is, right? And there's nothing to hold us back other than let's go vote hard. You know, you just gotta laugh sometimes. But as a Catholic in America, I find myself in a strange place. Precisely because Catholicism in America, I was gonna say it never had deep cultural roots, but it did at times, right? When we had those Irish communities, those Italian communities, those Polish and German communities in different parts of America. They immigrated here and they congregated in homogenous communities to kind of support each other. They spoke the same language, ate the same foods, that kind of stuff. But, you know, as we've known, certain liberal elements have gone into those communities, and those communities have now been broken up. So there's no enclave now for these children or these groups that have come from overseas, right? It's been a forced assimilation. Assimilation to what? So that's the question. Liberalism. I mean, we've all been kind of dispersed because of the global economy, right? The family's been broken. I said it before, it's not just Marxist values, or should I say Marxist social values and the attack on the family that has actually destroyed the family in America. It's also been the economics of the right. The right has supported globalist economic principles. And so when you got, one kid that now, goes to New York to get a job, your other kid finds a career out in Miami, and your other kid in San Francisco, your family's broken. Your family's broken now all of a sudden. It's been torn apart by global economy. but we all got to make the money in America, right? Because that's what we do, right? The material dialectic. That's the great principle of America. The money, the power, the wealth, the comforts, the pleasures, that's what we seek here, right? We don't have true religion. We don't have any true culture here, right? But we make the money. That's what we all came here for, right? In America, to make the money. So, for my part, as a guy that's moved out to Utah about 20 years ago from Los Angeles, leaving a predominantly Catholic area, I find myself in the wilderness, I'll be honest with you. And I think about my Catholic faith and the experiences I had, right? Being raised in a Sicilian household, having a direct link back to the old country. I speak the language. I visited Sicily when I was a kid. I'm planning on going back here in a few years. And I got some health issues that have been preventing me, but I'm working on it right now, right? Tiebacks, my grandparents were born in the old country. My parents were born in the old country. I have a serious link and connection to the old country, to the language, the culture, the food, the faith, everything. But my kids, told a different ballgame. Their experience is going to be a lot different than mine. They won't have that link back. As I said before, once you get to about the second generation in America, whether you're Italian or Irish or German or both, whatever it may be, the first thing to go is the language. And then once the language goes, then goes the culture. And once goes the culture, then goes the faith. You lose it all eventually in a pluralistic liberal society at some point. And that's the difficulties of it, you know. And in America, it becomes a different kind of Catholicism. There is no cultural reinforcement. You're kind of left on your own in many ways. And I think Catholicism in America has to be a heroic kind of faith, because the culture is not coming to rescue you if tragedy hits you. And I believe that's why we've lost so many, because we are a secular culture. Just look around, all the craziness. You know, liberalism has been destructive all over the world. I mean, and like I said, even in Italy, they're having a lot of these problems now because democracy, liberalism, it's crept in to all of the West, right? Post-World War II really cemented, you know, the sort of liberal dominance all over the world. And maybe I'm looking back to a time in the past that will never come back. Fine. But it was a world that made much more sense. You know, in America, faith is about an intellectual choice or an intellectual assent of some sort. My Catholic experience was always cultural, links back to my ancestral roots. My kids, it's going to be different. And it really does come down to if I raise them properly and just in this culture. I just desire something from the past that's missing. I truly despise our liberal culture in every capacity. It's rotten to the core. It's destroying families. It's destroying cultures. And this emphasis on, again, the material dialectic, the money, the money, the money. It's the bill of goods that we were sold on. Not just from the left, but from the right, just as much as anything else. That's why I say both political ideologies are broken in their own way. Granted, the left gets pretty kooky and satanic at some point. Don't get me wrong. I know that. I just think we've been sold a bad bill of goods for a long time. And I don't know if there's any fixing this, I'll be honest with you, other than heroic faith, praying your rosary, doing the best you can. Because even at this point in history, the church has been consumed by this liberal behemoth. There's something that I look back in my life and the things you take for granted, the things you miss, the things you lost, the people that are gone from your life, those that you've lost. Every time a family member dies, it's like a piece of history dies, you know? My father's side they're all gone now. I got cousins, they're wonderful cousins, I love them to death. But all my aunts and uncles on my father's side are gone. And my mother's side, they're up there in age now. And every time one goes, a piece of history goes, right? All the memories, all the wisdom, all the stories, and even the faith in many ways. And then it's up to my generation to try and pass that on. My Generation X has failed miserably. Look at our offspring. They're a freaking disaster. See, one of the great testaments of parenthood can be based upon the children you raise. And I'm far from a perfect father. But I just pray for their future. That's all I can do. That when I'm gone from this world, that I taught them enough to get by so they don't lose their faith. Because at the end of the day, faith is everything. That's how I've raised my kids. I raised them in the same traditions that my mom and dad and my grandparents raised me. Same church, same traditions, same devotions, the same prayers, the same mass. And I'll close out with this. It's interesting. The thing came up on my Facebook page. When was it? This morning. I posted this 2 years ago on my Facebook page. Here, let me pull it up real quick for you. I won't be able to show it to you, but I'll just read it to you real quick if I can get this to pop up. And I think, you guys will get my point, regardless of whatever your ancestral roots are, what race, what culture you are, you'll get it, right? And it said, quote, "Remember when our grandparents got off the boat? We were not just Italians, we were Catholics. The terms were synonymous." And yes, it was synonymous. It was synonymous. We, I don't know. I guess I'm being very nostalgic right now because of everything we've lost. Anyways, I want to thank you for joining me. Just a little rant tonight, I guess you could say. This is Frank signing off for Frank Speaking. Good night, everybody.